You probably have a fantasy draft coming up right now. That's why you're watching this video, but here's the deal. I'm also in dozens of fantasy drafts right now, and I cannot believe the amount of mistakes people are making at the wide receiver position, and I don't want you to make those. Everyone is drafting the wrong wide receivers, and instead, you should take the 5 guys in this video instead. And we'll start with the best of the best wide receivers. We're talking about those round 1 and round 2 guys, and I'm talking about this range of guys right here, where there's Marvin Harrison, Garrett Wilson, and Puka Nacua. Right now, Puka Nacua is going ahead of Garrett Wilson in fantasy drafts, despite just getting disclosed with an injury, and even before that injury, he was going way ahead of Garrett Wilson, and this is a mistake. And I know right away what people are going to say. Puka Nacua, I mean, this guy was fantastic. He's just 23 years old and South. Didn't you watch football last year? Isn't this your job? Didn't you know that this guy had the best rookie season of all time, broke all the Justin Jefferson or the Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, both of these guys' records with almost 1,500 receiving yards. By the way, top 5 in the NFL amongst all receivers, not just rookies, over 100 receptions, breaking rookie records, breaking Ram records, all of this stuff. And my answer would be yes, I saw all this, but heading into 2024, which is a brand new year with a lot of more new context, he doesn't have the same upside as Garrett Wilson. And I understand you're saying, how can that be possible? He just outproduced him last year alone as a rookie. Well, let me explain, because I know it sounds a little crazy. Well, we can start with right here. Puka Nacua right now is still competing with Cooper Kupp, who last year played the entire year injured. He got hurt in the preseason, in camp, missed the first month of camp, and the beginning of the season was banged up. And even though he was injured all year, had a hamstring later in the season, he still averaged the exact same amount of targets as Nacua. They both average 8.5 targets per game and very similar fantasy points per game in their completed starts together. And Puka last year finished as the wide receiver 6 in fantasy. Pretty good based on where he was going drafted and undrafted in a lot of leagues as a late round rookie. But here's the deal. That's as good of a season as you're probably going to see. Nearly 1,500 yards with Cooper Kupp injured, with Matthew Stafford in the offensive line holding up last year, which is like an up and down thing year to year with those situations. So what happens if Cooper Kupp is actually healthy? If Puka Nacua, who's starting the season injured right now, look, how much higher is he going to finish? He finished as the wide receiver 6 last year. He now goes as the wide receiver 7. I think he's being drafted as an absolute ceiling. And like I said, the guy's dealing with an injury. This was the original report. Jordan Rodriguez, a fantastic reporter, covers the Rams, and this is basically what they were saying. After team drills, it was a right knee injury for Puka Nacua. He's declared week to week right now. He probably will be ready for the start of the season, but even that's in question. Is it a strain? If it's a strain, those could last 2 to 3 weeks, or they could last 4 to 6 plus weeks, depending on how you let it recover and how quickly it recovers. So those things are all a concern, and I just don't have those same concerns when I look at Garrett Wilson, who this dude, since entering the NFL, has been a target monster. Hasn't missed a game in the NFL, and if you look at his targets right here, as a rookie, 147, and last year, 168, he ranks 4th in the NFL in targets during that time. The only people with more targets than him during that time are guys like Devontae Adams and Tyreek Hill, who are obviously the best of the best in the NFL. But the reason Garrett Wilson isn't getting the same hypo recognition as a Puka Nacua is because last year he didn't have as good of a season because he was playing with quarterbacks like Zach Wilson, Trevor Siemian, and a man named Tim Boyle. But despite the bad quarterback situation, the reason why Wilson was able to actually gain high targets is because of his elite skill set at getting open at all levels of the field and his lack of competition. And now he will have more competition on the team this year, but honestly, it's not by much. Like, the biggest piece is going to be Mike Williams, who I actually think's a nice pick in like round 13 of fantasy drafts right now, but he's 30 years old coming off of a torn ACL, mostly an outside receiver. And then 3rd round pick Malachi Corley, who at best is going to be competing with Xavier Gibson as a starting slot wide receiver to play, somewhere between 40 and 60% of the snaps. None of these guys are going to threaten Garrett Wilson, who should once again see 150 plus targets. And oh yeah, now he has Aaron Rodgers back. And I spend about an hour or 2 reading all the news each day, and this was one of the reports that I found from the New York Post. Aaron Rodgers and Garrett Wilson connection thriving at Jets practice. You see a bunch of tweets of them kind of going out there viral about them arguing with each other about the routes, and it's all fun and gesture and all fun and games afterwards. They're just laughing, saying that they're competitive, but these are the things that are important. And by the way, I read the news like 1 to 2 hours a day. I post all these thread recaps on like Twitter and Instagram and my Instagram stories, so follow me there as well. That's where you'll find like my up-to-the-minute news and reactions from preseason games, from the weekly news and all that, because it's harder to get those up in a YouTube video. They're longer to edit, and then it's like stale. You get it, right? Just follow me on those socials. Now, one more thing for the Garrett Wilson situation here is the New York Jets offensive line. PFF has them as a top 5 unit this year. Last year, they were a bottom 5 unit. At the very worst, they're going to be a top 10 unit, in my opinion, the biggest jump of any offensive line, because they signed Tyron Smith. They traded for Morgan Moses, so they got that fella back. And they also went out and drafted a first-round Olu Fashanu, a top 10 overall pick out of Penn State, a tackle who was arguably the best tackle in the draft. So when I'm looking at Garrett Wilson right now, for me, he is a top 10 overall player this year. You can see this is my fantasy blueprint. It's linked down below. Over 10,000 people are currently using it this year for their fantasy draft, so your league mates might be in there. Be sure to get it as well. You can see right here in the blue, this is Sal's rank. He's my top 10 overall player. I have him definitely ahead of guys like, and we can see how high ahead of guys, 6 picks ahead of a Puka Nacua, have him 7 picks ahead of a Marvin Harrison. It's no question at all. If he ever falls into the second round, slam dunk pick. But I do think he's top 10 worthy as a first round pick this year, and people are not drafting him enough compared to those other receivers. Now, next up, let's move to the second round, where there's a couple of receivers on this page I want to talk about. First off, we'll start with Devontae Adams, who people currently are taking with a top 20 overall pick, 17th overall. You can see right here on Fantasy Pros ADP. fantasy, and I want to compare him to Chris Olave, who goes 6 spots later in drafts, so a half a round later, but I believe Olave is a better pick. I have Olave ranked well ahead of Davante Adams right now, who to me is barely like a 3rd round worthy pick. And this will sound crazy to some people because just a couple years ago, Adams was like a borderline #1 overall fantasy option, definitely a 1st round pick, but things have changed. Even if you don't think Adams' skill set has changed after last year still being an absolute force in terms of earning targets, 175 targets last year, obviously elite. Even if you don't think his skill set has changed, he's still playing on a run-first offense with quarterbacks that are going to be guys in Gardner Minshew and Aiden O'Connell that don't give you a lot of confidence when it's a run-first offense. And oh yeah, Adams could fall off a cliff a little at age 32. Here's a tip for you. Past performance does not predict future outcomes. I feel like a financial advisor, but that's the case with Adams, who has 180 and 175 targets these past 2 years. That doesn't mean it's going to happen this year. Look, just straight up right now, I like Chris Olave, who is 8 years younger than Davante Adams right now. 8 years younger. I mean, that's insane in the NFL. This guy is entering the prime of his career, entering year 3 right now in Mr. Olave. And now he's going to have a brand new offense, which I actually think is quietly going to benefit him because Clint Kubiak comes over from the 49ers to be the new play caller for the Saints. And I think that's important because so far through his first 2 seasons, you're seeing Chris Olave like last year, rank 4th in deep targets, average target distance, 20th in terms of his average target distance. He's just being used as this deep threat, which isn't great, especially last year when you consider Derek Carr had no good offensive line play. He was being just blitzed a ton. And right here, unrealized air yards, so how much yards in air the ball was going and just not really resulting in a reception. Number 3 in the NFL, Olave last year. Over 1,000 air yards were just not even worthy, not even completed, overthrown, underthrown, just not thrown accurately because Derek Carr was running for his life. He was playing injured. The offensive line was absolutely atrocious. And don't get me wrong, we like to see our wide receivers have deep targets. Those are the cheat codes, but we want to see some consistency in them, and if they're not catchable, then what's the point? Now, Olave still led the Saints in targets last year per game. He had nearly 8 per game. He was Derek Carr's favorite target, but I think we're going to see more accurate targets this year. But it's not going to be because of the offensive line. The offensive line is not great by any means. This was already a bottom 5 unit, and now PFF has them as the worst offensive line in the NFL because they lost right tackle Ryan Ramczyk, who will likely need to miss the entire of the season right here. You can see due to a preseason injury, just brutal. This was already an offensive line that really didn't have any stud pieces. Now you might be saying, oh, isn't it just going to be a repeat of last year? No, because I mentioned Clint Kubiak and new play callers there. He comes over for the 49ers, and that's key. Because Clint Kubiak, the passing game coordinator last year for the 49ers, what did that offense rely on? The West Coast offense. This was an offense that wanted to get the ball out quick, so that benefits when you have a bad offensive line, and get it into receivers' hands in space. That means quick crossing routes, getting yards after the catch. And Chris Olave, even though he's been used as a downfield receiver, he can run routes in the middle of the field and pick up yards after the catch. And Clint Kubiak in the 49ers, I mean, that offense over there in San Francisco is used to not having the best offensive line. Sure, they had Trent Williams, who's great in his own right, an offensive lineman, but outside of that, they've just been able to survive with the quick passing game. So when it comes down to it right now, I want Chris Olave over Davante Adams, no doubt about it. I take a lot of guys over him, and I think Chris Olave quietly in year 3, this could be his breakout season that many people have been waiting for. I have him as a bona fide sure thing top 20 pick in fantasy in my fantasy blueprint. And speaking of that, the fantasy blueprint is available. It has been available. Over 10,000 of you are currently using it, and maybe somebody in your league. And here's the deal. Do you want to win your fantasy league? You just click this button right here, and it will take you to a page. It'll be linked down below where this year you can get my fantasy blueprint completely risk-free through one of our 2 partners below. You go through those options. And what does it mean to get it risk-free? Well, if you don't make your fantasy playoffs, beautiful people, fellow, lady, whoever it is watching this, I refund your one-time payment of $10. That's it. You get it refunded if you don't make your fantasy playoffs, no questions asked. So if you want to get access to the fantasy blueprint that 10,000 other people are currently using, 10,000 plus people right now to win their league, smack around their friends, scan the QR code on the screen or click the link in the description below, and we'll get you set up with that. Not now, but right now. All right, next up, I want to talk about some young studs in the middle to later rounds, which is exactly the type of players you should be drafting here. And we're going to look at Jaxon Smith-Njigba, who currently goes right now about 50 to 60% of the time ahead of Rome Odunze in fantasy drafts. And in my opinion, Odunze should be going ahead of Jaxon Smith-Njigba at least 60 to 70+% of the time. Now, Jaxon Smith-Njigba was a first-round pick last year for the Seattle Seahawks, right? And he was misused by offensive coordinator Shane Waldron, who left Seattle and is now on Chicago with Rome Odunze. So I can see why some people might be concerned for Odunze, and then you get JSN, Smith-Njigba, getting a new offensive coordinator in Ryan Grubb from college who wants to throw the ball more. So with those 2 pieces of information, you might be saying, well, yeah, shouldn't Jaxon Smith-Njigba be going before Rome Odunze? Well, hold on. Because even though Rome Odunze has Shane Waldron was still a pass-happy coordinator in Seattle. He threw at a top 10 rate in neutral situations his last 2 years with the Seahawks. And not to mention, Odunze went with a top 10 overall pick, probably would have been last year in Jaxon Smith-Njigba's draft, a top 5 overall pick. He's just a much better prospect and wins in different areas than JSN. And now these guys are pretty similar, not just because of the Shane Waldron connection and them being young stud players, but also their wide receiver rooms are loaded with veteran talent. You can see Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf is who JSN is going to have to compete with. If we go over to the page for the Bears, you have DJ Moore coming off of a career year. Keenan Allen coming off of a year where he led the NFL NFL in targets per game. So yeah, these are not easy situations for these younger players to come into or easy offenses. But Rome Odunze is a player who can win on the outside, and that's primarily where he will win in the NFL compared to JSN, who's mostly been a slot receiver in college. In the NFL, it just leads to less bigger plays and less snaps on the field in two wide receiver sets. And not to mention, if there's other veteran talent ahead of you, it just means less attention for the talented rookie in Rome Odunze to be getting worse cornerbacks that he'll win against. Odunze, if you're not familiar, is just an absolute monster. This is his player profiler metrics. The higher to 100 percentile, the better. The speed is fantastic. 94th percentile speed score. The catch radius, 97th percentile. This guy was a contested catch artist in college. He was somebody who won not only with explosiveness at the catch point and route running, but also after the catch, which is exactly why when you look at all these stats right here, just follow this bottom line, which is the easiest. He had almost over 1,500 yards last year in college on 141 targets. He was an absolute force, again, winning at all levels of the field, can play in the slot, out wide, win short, wins deep, everything. This guy is a stud. And I wouldn't be shocked if by the end of the year, he's the best wide receiver on this team. He's a top 10 overall pick. He's that talented. He has similar talent level, if not more than, no better than a DJ Moore, and Keenan Allen just a little bit older. Right now in camp, the reports are that the Williams-Odunze connection has been consistent early on. Odunze has emerged as Caleb Williams' favorite target in camp for what it's worth as of right now. I think this is kind of important. These guys have been roommates in rookie OTAs. They've been just together. They came into the same draft. The rookies coming into league. They have a lot of common, and that bond is forming. So when I look at round 9, I do have to admit I like some other positions there. I like Jonathan Brooks, who is falling right now in drafts because people think he's going to miss 4 weeks, which is not even a guarantee. I like Brian Robinson. He'll be in an upcoming video. I think he's great. I like the running backs in this range, but if you were to have to go out and get a wide receiver, that's exactly where I'd start to look for a Rome Odunze, definitely over a JSN right now. And this next situation is one that's really surprising to me. I would be taking this wide receiver just rounds before the other guy we're going to talk about. And if that's a little confusing, let me clear it up right here, because right now in round 7, Deontay Johnson is going right next to back-to-back Rashee Rice. I'd be taking Deontay Johnson 1 to 2 rounds earlier than this if I had to make sure I get him. Obviously don't, because you're just overdrafting at that point, but I would. I'm just saying that's how much I like him. And Rashee Rice goes at least 1 to 2 rounds too early in my opinion. Let's break it down. It seems like people are just not paying attention to the offseason. They're looking at last year and just assuming that's going to be similar situations. It's not at all, especially when you look at just the last couple of weeks alone. Deontay Johnson is now in the Panthers, and their new, innovative, young head coach, Dave Canales, who has been great the last 2 years as a coach on the Seahawks and the Bucks, basically said, our offense right now, we really want to feature someone. And for us right now, where is Deontay Johnson? Oh, so they want to feature Deontay Johnson. It makes sense. His competition on this team is a 34-year-old Adam Thielen and a rookie Xavier Legette, who's already been injured twice in training camp. But that just shows that they want to feed this guy. He could see 150 targets this year, Deontay Johnson. And meanwhile, on the flip side for the Chiefs, their whole offseason has been throwing the ball deep. And if you can see right here, this is what they're doing in camp. Patrick Mahomes found wide receiver Xavier Worthy for a touchdown deep. Okay, what else? Wide receiver Hollywood Brown later hauled in a pair of deep catches. McCole Hardman for a touchdown deep into the middle of the field. What's the name you're not seeing there? Rashee Rice. Why? Because his role last year was to catch short passes. He wasn't a player used downfield. He wasn't able to win downfield last year as a rookie. No, instead Rashee Rice went out there and he did earn a lot of targets. Over 100 targets as a rookie for a guy who really wasn't used the first 5 or 6 weeks of the season all that much. But on average, his target went just 4.8 yards downfield. Wasn't seeing deep targets. Wasn't even seeing intermediate targets. He was seeing targets on average less than 5 yards downfield. That was basically just inside the top 100 wide receivers, which is pretty brutal. And it just leads to not a lot of explosive plays. It means you have to be great from a yards after the catch standpoint, which he's just okay in that area. And now you have to start to put these pieces together with these new wide receivers. Marquise Brown on a 1-year deal. First round pick they traded up for Xavier Worthy in town. They're going to be earning targets downfield and earning more targets than guys like MVS did and Sky Moore last year and Kadarius Toney, which means 2 things. One, Rashee Rice's short passing game isn't going to be there as enough as the Chiefs, or isn't going to be there as much as the Chiefs look to throw the ball downfield. And Rashee Rice just in general now is going to see less targets. His 102 last year might be around 100 or so, might drop to like 80 or 90 because these other guys are going to earn significant roles, at least more than the guys there did last year. And now you compare that to the Deontay Johnson competition that we were talking about. Adam Thielen, 34 years old, not too concerned. Xavier Legette, who seems to be talented, a little bit of a raw wide receiver, already injured twice in camp right now with, I believe, both a foot injury. If we look at this, let's pull it up. He had a hamstring in rookie OTAs that he returned from, and then he goes out there and he has a foot injury, and as you can see here, they ruled out a fracture, which is good. So maybe this is just a couple of days, maybe a couple weeks. It has not come out yet, but if it's anything like plantar fasciitis, if it's anything like a foot sprain, a bone bruise, that's going to be weeks to months of recovery time. So fingers crossed for the rookie, he can get out there on the field earlier, but this is all the competition Deontay has. And by the way, Deontay Johnson is elite at getting open. He's still pretty much in the prime of his career. At 27 years old, has about another year of that prime, which would be this year right now. This is a guy who ranks since 2020 6th in targets in the NFL. He knows how to get open, and now he has a coach that knows how to maximize his players' skill sets in Dave Canales, just like he did last year with Rachaad White, who had a great year, and definitely Mike Evans, who had a great year. And sure, you might be thinking, oh, the Panthers were so bad last year. Yeah, a lot has changed since last year. For starters, they have Diontae Johnson, obviously. They have the coach Dave Canales, like we talked about. We talked about them bringing in a rookie wide receiver in Xavier Legette. They ended up signing, these were big right here, Robert Hunt and Damian Lewis, guards in free agency. Their offensive line was terrible last year. It should be widely improved this year because they go from being the worst unit in the league last year to now being a top 20 unit, according to PFF, the second largest jump of any offensive line this offseason because of those guards that they signed. Damian Lewis, a veteran. Robert Hunt comes over from Miami, a veteran. These pieces right here are going to be big pieces that are going to help Bryce Young in this offense just kind of get some timing and consistency down, especially for Young, who didn't have that in his rookie year. Now, one more thing I want to point out is 33-year-old Adam Thielen last year. Through the first 3 games of the season, check this out right here. He averaged 18.7 fantasy points, 9.5 targets per game. As a 33-year-old, Diontae Johnson is 27, is a more talented receiver at this stage than Adam Thielen was last year. I think Diontae Johnson won't fall off in the second half of the year like Adam Thielen did, and will be able to compete with this type of volume. 7, 8, or 9 to 10 targets a game. 18.7 fantasy points per game. This was top 10 wide receiver production for Adam Thielen of all people. Diontae Johnson has a lot of upside this year because the offense got better, the play caller got better, Bryce Young enters year 2, and I think he's going to produce more than one Adam Thielen did at 33 last year. So if I pull up the fantasy blueprint right now, again, you can get this down below right now if you want to have a much better chance at winning your fantasy league, and your friends might have the blueprint, so you just got to keep up with them at that point. But I see right here, 10 spot difference. So I'm a 10 spot difference, meaning I have him ranked 10 spots higher than ADP. I'm a round higher on Diontae Johnson. I'm fine taking him 6 to 8 picks earlier if it means you secure him at the beginning of a round before your next turn comes around in a draft. Okay, now the next guys I want to talk about, and I might get crucified for this one. I'm going to lose some of the party here. I'm sorry. Hey. I'm sorry about this one, but please let me explain it first. I'm looking at one Nico Collins, who goes as a top 15 wide receiver and a 2nd to 3rd round pick, compared to Jalen Waddle, who goes, 3 spots after him at the wide receiver position, about a round later in fantasy drafts. I personally would just rather have, just straight up right now, give me Waddle. And I kind of feel like the Max Kellerman could. Give me Waddle, give me Iguodala, right? But is it really that crazy compared to Kellerman? Right now, Collins is being taken ahead of Waddle in over 80% of fantasy drafts, which is just pretty nuts. And look, I get it. Collins was good last year, right? This dude was fantastic. He ends up popping off in year 3 for a massive breakout season. He puts up 80 receptions, almost 1,300 total yards. If I talk about his efficiency metrics, yards per route run, winning downfield, all these areas, the guy was great. I'm not going to say anything bad about him. I think he's a good player. But let me ask you if you knew this stat before watching some of my content, that last year in his completed games with Tank Dell averaged more targets per game and fantasy points per game. And now you bring back Tank Dell from an injury and you add Stefon Diggs to this receiver room, and I honestly think that this team is going to pass or run a little bit more than people expect, because it's not the best offensive line in the world. It wasn't last year, and that's why they ran more than people expect. I think the Stefon Diggs assignment or signing, people think they're just going to automatically be this top 5 pass rate team. You really can't do that when your offensive line is a bottom 10 unit. And if you didn't have Laramie Tunsil, this one piece right here, you'd probably be a bottom 3 unit. If anything happens to Laramie Tunsil, that's how thin their depth is on this offensive line. This is one of the worst offensive lines in the league if anything happens to him. So yeah, I think there's a little bit of a concern here. I think people think they're just going to throw at a top 5 rate. I think they'll throw above a league average or right around a league average, but not as high as people expect. And then that takes me to Jalen Waddle, who has just been the definition of automatic since he's entered the NFL. And you can see it right here. In 3 years in the NFL, he's had over 1,000 yards every single season, including a 1,300-yard season while playing next to Tyreek Hill. And he's done it in a bunch of different ways. In year 1, he wasn't asked to win downfield, just short targets. He had 100+ catches, average yards per reception, 9.8. Then he led the NFL with 18.1 yards per reception and had the monster year next to Tyreek. And last year, 14.1 yards per reception, kind of did a little bit of both. All of that to say, this guy in Jalen Waddle is quietly great. He's quietly elite. If Tyreek Hill wasn't on this team, he'd easily be a top 10, if not higher, fantasy option. And I'm not talking at the wide receiver position. I'm talking overall. That's how good he is, and I'll show you why in a second. But I think this is a sneaky thing that we should talk about. Obviously, Tyreek Hill is there. The recently big extension he got, the #1 overall player according to NFL for the rankings, and the players voted on him. But Odell Beckham Jr. signing on this team, I know he's older, but this is a guy who's going to play X receiver. He's definitely going to play over Braxton Berrios. He's definitely going to play over a late-round rookie in Malik Washington and Eric Uzoma, who really hasn't done anything since entering the NFL. If Odell Beckham Jr. is playing, he'll probably play on the outside. If he's playing on the outside and Tyreek is playing on the outside for about 50% of the snaps, there's going to be more opportunities for Jalen Waddle in the slot to not have to win downfield as much. And it won't be a slot-only role. I think Waddle will play in 2 wide receiver sets ahead of Odell Beckham Jr., but you'll just get more slot snaps than you had last year, which means easier receptions and yards after the catch for Waddle. And also, I should point out, Tyreek Hill has only missed 1 game in the 2 years compares with Waddle. Imagine if he misses more times than that, you're going to have Waddle seeing at least 2 or 3 or 4 massive weeks in fantasy, because look at the one time that he missed a game, Tyreek Hill. Jalen Waddle, in that one game, you can see right here on RotoViz, had 28.2 fantasy points on 9 targets and 142 receiving yards. He had a touchdown or 2 in that game. Obviously, it's one game sample. That's not going to happen every time. But for the people who say Waddle has no upside, he doesn't have these boom weeks, the one time Tyreek Hill was out, he had a monster week. And he finishes the top 20 receiver last year alongside one Tyreek Hill, despite only having 4 touchdowns. Those 4 touchdowns are definitely going to go up based on the target volume that he saw of 104 targets in just 14 games. Players with similar volume last year were seeing around 6 or 7 touchdowns. So the touchdowns will go up, the role might get a little bit better, and if anything, he could see even higher weeks if Tyreek was aging a little bit, right? An aging receiver, and just naturally speaking, misses a game or 2 or 3. So give me Jalen Waddle over Nico Collins all day, in my opinion. And by the way, over 60% of you are not subscribed to this YouTube channel. I get it. You forget. You watch on your phone or your TV. You don't even know you could hit the subscribe button. This is just a little bit of a nudge to hit that button. It really helps the channel as it grows. It helps me put out even more content for you beautiful people. Honestly, it goes a long way. Hit that subscribe button. And now let me tell you about a couple of like 3rd or 4th or maybe even 5th round wide receivers, depending on your draft. DJ Moore compared to T. Higgins, who DJ Moore right now goes in round 4 of drafts. Usually he goes in round 3, and T. Higgins has been falling into round 5 of drafts. I'd rather just straight up have T. Higgins over DJ Moore. You don't even have to do that, but if you're close in a draft between those two, I want T. Higgins. And look, I get it. DJ Moore is coming off of a career year. 90% of people are taking him over T. Higgins in drafts this year, and that's just wrong in my opinion. You look at what he did last year, DJ Moore. I'm not going to say anything bad about it. 96 catches, career high over 1,300 yards, was top 10 in the NFL, borderline top 5 in that metric last year, but now he's in a whole new situation. He has a new play caller, a new quarterback, and new competition in Keenan Allen and Rome Odunze. And not to mention, the offensive line is quietly a borderline top 10 unit, and they have a 3-headed backfield, which could lead to even more running plays. I don't necessarily think that's going to happen. I think the Bears are probably going to throw right around a top 10 rate, but the offensive line improving should lead to more efficiency in the run game, which can just set up a couple of more rushes per game. So nothing is the same for DJ Moore. And by the way, that's the best Drake album. Nothing is the same, but a player who has basically the same situation or better at a similar spot in the drafts is Mr. T. Higgins. And I get why people are out on Higgins right now, because last year was brutal if you took him as like a 3rd round pick. He finishes the wide receiver 40 overall. It was his worst year in the NFL, a wide receiver 40 finish, but here's the deal. He left 3 games early. That's kind of skewing this sample. If you only look at his 9 completed games where he started and completed them healthy, last year T. Higgins averaged 14.1 points and 8.3 targets per game, which is much closer to a top 20 wide receiver finish. And those 8.3 targets per game look a lot better than the 6.3 targets per game he was averaging when you're actually putting in those games where he left early, which in my opinion isn't fair to do. And there's also the case that has to be made that last year Joe Burrow basically started the season injured for the first month and a half, and then didn't play the final month and a half of the season. So the only time that Joe Burrow was out there with T. Higgins was for 5 games. And in all 5 of those games, Joe Burrow wasn't 100% healthy. But if we were to pull up RotoViz here and look at their career games together, T. Higgins with Joe Burrow in 46 career games averages over 14 fantasy points, 7.4 targets per game. That's right around a top 20 wide receiver finish. That's right around where he's going in drafts right now. Actually, even a little bit later, he's going in drafts right now, like as a wide receiver 24 or 25. And that doesn't even factor in that Tyler Boyd is no longer on the team. And right now, it's going to be like Andre Isavas right now in camp, or the rookie Jermaine Burton taking over for that role. But I don't think either of them will be as good as the veteran slot receiver in Tyler Boyd. With him gone, you might see T. Higgins see 10%, 20% more slot snaps, which should lead to better, easier catches, yards after the catch opportunities, maybe better red zone role with Tyler Boyd gone as well. And we should point out that the offensive line, although not great, should be improved as they signed tackle Trent Brown, and they signed or drafted 1st round pick Amarius Mims, who's this big monster, 360-pound offensive lineman who should just help the entire offense. And obviously Joe Burrow, who, knock on wood right now, is finally cleared to play. He looks healthy, and this would be the first time he enters a season healthy, 100% healthy. So as you can see in my fantasy blueprint right now, T. Higgins, I am 16 spots ahead of the market, my 42nd overall player, compared to DJ Moore, who's my 49th overall player. So the proof is in the pudding. I like T. Higgins more. I'm 9 spots below the market on DJ Moore for the stated reasons right there. And these are the guys that you should be drafting in fantasy. Now that's at the wide receiver position, but if you want to see the guys that you should be drafting at the running back position, well, a video is going to pop up right here, and the guys you should be avoiding at every single position this year, otherwise you're going to have massive regrets, well, then you can check out this video right over here. Watch either one of those. You have some fun, right? That's how this YouTube thing works. And I'll see you all, beautiful people, in the next one.